May we begin with the word of prayer together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I was kind of born into the church. I've mentioned that before. I'm a multi-generational church person, and it was our custom to go to church. And on Easter was always a special occasion in our family. And as a little kid, my earliest memories of going to church on Easter were two instructions: don't get dirty and don't mess up your clothes. Because my parents would always buy me some special Easter outfit, and typically I looked like a walking Easter egg. I'd be green or yellow or purple or some color with shorts and a shirt that matched, and the goal was not to get my clothes dirty before Easter service is over, because there was always some family photo that would happen afterwards. Then went dirt streaks all over my clothing at the end. But those are my earliest memories about Easter, were don't get in trouble, don't get dirty, and behave. It was kind of the earlier memories I had of Easter. And it was later that Easter sort of began to kind of grow on me a little bit. It wasn't so much about what I was wearing and not getting dirty. It got to the point where my ears could begin to hear some of the story of what this Easter message was really all about. And I had questions about Jesus, and I would probably say I still have questions about Jesus and his ministry and what he was all about. And really the whole life cycle of Jesus, in essence, is kind of a mystery. At Jesus' birth, hardly anybody knew Jesus entered the world. We have evidences that maybe only a few people made their way to Bethlehem to welcome this infant child into the world. Some of this quiet evening entry in the world. And then there's only two Gospels that really have birth narratives in them. Mark and John don't really have the birth narratives. Matthew and Luke kind of give us hints of that. And then the birth narratives kind of fade away. And the next thing we know, Jesus is an adult out in the wilderness, finding John the Baptist on the edges of the water to be baptized. We got hints of this mysterious beginning. Jesus, Messiah, God's Son, born in a manger, in a stable, in a barn out back somewhere? Surely not. That's really not how it began. He finds himself on the River Jordan. John the Baptist says, "It's not me that needs to be baptized. You need to baptize me." But Jesus says, "No, you need to baptize me." And John the Baptist did. And his ministry was off and running. He gathered some disciples around him, and the things they began to do were pretty remarkable. And these disciples were not anybody that was on the upper echelons of the cream of the crop people that Jesus surrounded himself with. They were tax collectors and fishermen and people on the margins. And who was this Jesus, and why did he pull this band of characters together to come proclaim the kingdom of God here and now in this time and place? I'm not sure. Jesus could have gotten the best public speakers. Jesus could have gotten the people that had the most influence in their communities, and yet he got the people furthest from all the criteria we think of running a successful organization. Jesus did everything but in that case. And all along the way, Jesus kind of hinted at things. I used to think it was almost like this predetermined notion of Jesus knowing the outcome. 3 times in the Gospels, he says, there will be a time when I must suffer and die and rise again. 3 times he hints at those closest to him that this will happen to him. I'm thinking, was it predetermined that all this was going to happen? I think not. I think Jesus knew that as he was proclaiming his message, by its very nature, it was controversial. It was controversial by who he included, who he greeted. Picking up a small little child and putting them on his knee and saying, if you don't welcome a child like this, you may not find a welcome from God. And children had no place in society at the time, no voice, no significance, no importance. And then there was the women. Gosh, Jesus included women more than anybody else had. They were almost like extended disciples to him. And then there was the lepers and the outcasts and all those people. They'd be crying from the edges of the community, Jesus, save us. And most people would keep a distance from them because they didn't want to be unclean themselves. But Jesus went over, touched them, greeted them, had conversation with them, even invited them to dinner. I think Jesus knew all along if we're going to live out God's love the way God's love was supposed to be lived out, it's going to cause a little stir. It's going to cause a little trouble. It's going to cause a little angst in the system in which people were currently living. Everything Jesus did essentially was controversial to the powers and privileges of the day. So we tried to hint along the way, what I'm saying sounds good, but to many ears, it's a message and a proclamation that's a threat. It wasn't long where Jesus enters Jerusalem for the very first time. He cleanses the temple. He goes in and turns over the tables. And one of the first verses we get after he turns over the tables is the leaders begin to plot how they're going to kill Jesus. It seems like all along, Jesus knew the message was controversial. But Jesus never backed down from his message. He never relented on his radical welcome, this open hospitality, this grandiose love that was to model God's creative force in the world. And then he's killed. And as Kathy eloquently shared that story in John's gospel of the discovery of the tomb. Mary Magdalene goes and she leans in and looks and sees the tomb is rolled away and quickly darts back to the disciples. The disciples make their mad dash to the tomb. One looks in, one goes in, and they realize Jesus isn't there. And my guess is there's probably more confusion than celebration. What's going on? Now, here where it gets kind of interesting in the story. We may not think of it this way, but this is kind of where the conspiracy theory stuff starts to happen. Somebody stole the body. Someone did this. And what about this? And gosh, we know about conspiracy theories today, don't we? It doesn't take much for some theory to take on a life of its own. And gosh, how divided our own country is based on conspiracy theories. But there's a scientific principle out there called Occam's razor. You may have heard about it. Occam's razor basically said when there's multiple conclusions of how you get to some resolution, the simplest is often the most true. Now we could think of stolen body, someone came in here and messed with the tomb. We can think about all these things, but we go back and do all the accounts of the Gospels, and we just look at Jesus' life and what he did and what angst it created to the system and his own forecasting that this is going to happen to me. It would seem like the simplest result is if we read the story and we follow the actual storyline of Jesus itself, what we get at the end is a full message of what he'd been proclaiming all along. That God redeems even the muckiest, dirtiest stuff in the world. Jesus proclaimed redemption, and now his very life is redeemed by God in that moment, so that humanity has the possibility of a future that is on the cusp of something miraculous. When I was a little kid in science class, one of the things all little kids have in science class is a teacher will have a big bowl of dirt in these small little containers, and they're teaching you about how things grow. And so one of my science teachers said, I want you to scoop up some dirt, put it in this little bowl, and I'm going to have you take this little seed and put it in the dirt, and you're going to water it. You won't see anything for a little while, but if you take good care of that dirt and you water a little bit every day and put a little water in that little bowl of dirt, at some point, something's going to sprout out of that dirt, and you will see life emerge from the soil. Now, the teachers were smart, and they picked the fastest growing plants because they knew that little kids weren't very patient. So they picked the ones that would take about 2 days, and you'd see something starting to poke out of there. Mom, Dad, something's growing out of the seed I planted in the dirt. I tell that story because I think Jesus' life was simply a seed. His entire life was a seed. And at some point, that seed, for it to be what a seed's supposed to be, it has to be buried. It has to be below the ground before anything can happen. And as that seed begins to form the beginnings of a plant, this transformation happens from Jesus to us, is that we become the bloom. That Jesus started out as a seed, and now we are the next stage of the growth process. We move beyond the conspiracy theories and, what happened to Jesus and all of that. Thomas Aquinas used to say that there is a difference between knowledge and faith. Knowledge is something we just know, Aquinas said. But at some point, knowledge only takes us so far, and we need something else. Faith takes us to something we cannot prove. And that gap between knowledge and faith, it is bridged what we call trust. At some point, we have to believe what seems unbelievable. But my thought is, this idea of resurrection, which may seem kind of like a hard concept to get around, of risen from the dead. In essence, this risen from the dead was modeled in the very life of Jesus himself. The things that he did, the ways that he behaved, the words that he offered. There was no hiding in his ministry what the resurrection reveals. It was simply an earlier version. Everything before the resurrection was seed life. Everything after the resurrection is blooming new life. And once the women and the disciples get past their initial confusion, and they get to the place where they say, I believe. Once they say that, it's not just one plant. It's not just a garden. It is a world covered in blooms and flowers and possibilities. Just think of it. A woman and 2 disciples make their way to the tomb over 2,000 years ago. Over 2,000 years ago. And here we sit in the sanctuary, or here you sit in your home, or wherever you might be watching from the service. And we're telling that same story. If we really believe the story, we're right where we need to be. I've often said that the sanctuary in Easter is much like the tomb. The work begins when we leave the tomb. Today, on Easter Day, on this resurrection day, on the day that Christ is risen and defies everything we can think of, it's actually simply Jesus being Jesus and us responding with belief that this Jesus we believe in calls us to something significant in the world. And man, do we need to plant some more seeds. Our world needs more flowers and blooms. Just look around and you can see the pain. And you can see the exclusion. And you can see all the isms that are out there of people feeling as though they are no worth at all. And we know how to do it because Jesus already modeled it to us in his ministry. The resurrection ministry we're called to live is embodying the seed ministry he already modeled to us. Occam's razor says, the simplest explanation is simply the best one to go with. Jesus' ministry was simple, as complex as it looked. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's about as good news as it gets. And when we come to the tomb and we see a stone rolled away, we're simply left with the opportunity to believe and carry that seed out into the world to make the difference God already knows is possible in us. Thanks be to God. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed.